Hello and welcome everybody to another episode of Books and Bytes. Today, we're going on a deep dive into Niall Ferguson's War of the World, 20th-Century Conflict and the Descent of the West.
Oh, yeah. This is a great one.
Yeah, it really is.
So much to unpack here.
Yeah, and I think it's going to be a really fascinating look at, what made the 20th century such a bloody period in history.
You know what I think is so interesting about Ferguson's work is that he doesn't just rehash the same old narratives about like World War I and World War II. He really challenges us to look beyond the surface and think about all the underlying social and economic and even racial dynamics that were at play.
Yeah, I have to admit, when I first picked up this book, I was kind of expecting a pretty straightforward account of the major wars, but Ferguson really throws you a curveball right from the start. He actually argues that the 20th century wasn't necessarily more violent than other periods in history.
That's interesting.
It's just that the nature of violence changed.
I see. So it's not necessarily about the quantity of violence, but more about the way in which violence was carried out.
Exactly.
So how it happened.
He says that 20th century saw a shift from limited warfare between states to total war.
And that total war is where civilians become targets.
Right, and that the scale of death and destruction reaches these unprecedented levels.
Yeah, and he suggests that this shift was driven by this really potent mix of factors.
So that's where his fatal formula comes in. He's basically arguing that these three key ingredients, ethnic conflict, economic volatility, and imperial decline, they all kind of combine to create this global tinderbox in the 20th century.
He lays out a really compelling case for this, too. He pulls in examples from all over the globe. You see it in the Russian pogroms in the early 1900s, the Armenian genocide during World War I, and then even later you have the Rwandan genocide in the 1990s. And, these aren't just isolated incidents. They're all symptomatic of this much deeper trend.
It's like a pattern almost, a recurring theme. And it's interesting how he connects all of this to the rise of racial thinking, which might seem like kind of a surprising topic for a book about war.
Yeah, you wouldn't necessarily think those two would go hand in hand.
Right.
But he's a really good job of tracing the roots of modern racial thinking, all the way back to the 18th century. And he highlights how seemingly scientific ideas about racial hierarchies and the concept of immutable racial identities helped lay the groundwork for all these ethnic conflicts that would erupt in the 20th century.
I found that chapter on Linnaeus and his racial classifications in Systema Naturae to be so eye-opening. It's crazy to think that these ideas, which we now recognize as absurd and dangerous, were once considered to be legitimate science.
It's wild, isn't it? Just how much our understanding of things has changed. And Ferguson points out that this whole shift toward racial thinking, it was actually a departure from the more fluid identities that existed in earlier periods, like in the Roman Empire. You could become Roman just by adopting their culture and customs.
Right, it was more about assimilation.
Exactly.
But then in the 19th century, this idea of fixed biological races took hold.
And it had this huge impact on how people viewed themselves and others.
It's it created this us versus them mentality.
Exactly.
So you've got these simmering racial tensions. And then you add in economic instability on top of that. And Ferguson argues that the Great Depression of the 1930s is a prime example of how economic hardship can create fertile ground for extremism and violence.
Absolutely. He shows how the economic collapse of the 1930s led to widespread unemployment, social unrest, and this kind of pervasive sense of desperation that made people way more susceptible to radical ideologies.
Like fascism and communism. It's when people are struggling to survive, they're more likely to cling to extreme solutions.
They're looking for answers, for someone or something to blame.
And then, of course, you've got the decline of empires, which Ferguson argues is another major driver of conflict in the 20th century.
Yeah, he describes it as this domino effect almost, with the collapse of one empire leading to the destabilization of entire regions.
Right, like the collapse of the Ottoman Empire after World War I.
Yeah.
That created all these new states in the Middle East.
Now, a lot of times those new states had these really poorly defined borders.
And they didn't really take into account the existing ethnic and religious divisions.
Which, of course, we see continuing to fuel conflict in the region today.
It's like you said, a domino effect.
Yeah.
One thing leads to another, and it all kind of spirals out of control.
Exactly.
And this brings us to World War I, which Ferguson sees as this real turning point in history.
A watershed moment.
Yeah, he argues that the war shattered this illusion of European stability and basically ushered in an era of unprecedented violence.
One of the most powerful parts of the book for me was his description of the horrors of trench warfare. He talks about these soldiers being trapped in these muddy, rat-infested ditches. They're constantly under fire, witnessing just unimaginable brutality.
It's no wonder that so many of them came back with what we now call PTSD.
Right, it was just absolutely traumatizing.
And he even quotes from Eric Maria Remarque's All Quiet on the Western Front.
Oh, such a good book.
I know, which so vividly captures the psychological toll of the war on these young soldiers. There's this one passage that really stuck with me, where the protagonist Paul Boehmer says, "We are forlorn like children and experienced like old men. We are crude and sorrowful and superficial. I believe we are lost."
Wow. That's powerful.
It really is.
It just speaks to that dehumanizing nature of war
Yeah.
and how it can just completely shatter even the most basic sense of hope and optimism.
And what's really interesting is how Ferguson connects World War I to the rise of dictators like Hitler, Mussolini, and Stalin. He argues that the war created the perfect conditions for these totalitarian regimes to take root.
It's like the war broke something in the collective psyche of Europe. The old order had collapsed, and people were so desperate for strong leaders who promised to restore order and national pride.
But those leaders often exploited people's fears and prejudices.
Right, they preyed on people's anxieties and insecurities.
And that led to even more violence and oppression.
It's a vicious cycle.
It really is.
Ferguson does a really good job of explaining how those dictators, they were products of their time.
But he also holds them accountable for their action.
Oh, absolutely.
He doesn't shy away from describing the brutality of their regimes and the horrific consequences of their ideologies.
No, he definitely doesn't pull any punches.
And then, of course, we have World War II, which Ferguson argues was in many ways a continuation of the conflicts that had begun in 1914.
Yeah, he sees it as the culmination of all these trends he's been outlining. This tragic outcome of that fatal formula we talked about earlier.
The ethnic conflict, economic volatility, and imperial decline.
Exactly.
But he also challenges that simplistic narrative of good versus evil that often surrounds World War II.
Ah, I see. So he's digging deeper, trying to get beyond that black and white thinking.
Exactly. He highlights examples of Allied brutality as well, like the firebombing of Dresden and the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
It forces us to confront the moral complexities of war.
Right. And the fact that there's not always a clear-cut right and wrong.
It's not always so simple.
Definitely not.
He even questions whether World War II truly marked the end of the conflict between the West and the East.
Which is a great point, because the Cold War was just around the corner.
And even though it wasn't a hot war in the traditional sense, it was still a period of intense rivalry, proxy wars, and that constant looming threat of nuclear annihilation.
Right. It was a different kind of war, but a war nonetheless.
Absolutely.
And it's fascinating how Ferguson connects the Cold War back to those same underlying factors. That had fueled all the conflict in the first half of the century.
So he's seeing the same patterns repeating themselves.
Exactly.
So the Cold War wasn't just this ideological battle between the U.S. and the Soviet Union.
He argues it was also a struggle over the spoils of those collapsed European empires. It was like a new chapter in this ongoing competition for global power.
And he also highlights how the Cold War actually made ethnic conflicts worse in a lot of cases, especially in places like Korea, Vietnam, and Afghanistan.
Right. And often with devastating consequences for the people who live there.
It's tragic.
It really is.
So even though the 20th century saw the end of traditional empires, those old patterns of conflict didn't just disappear, they transformed and reemerged in these new and often even more dangerous forms.
Like Mark Twain said, history doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes.
I love that quote.
Yeah, it's so true.
And I think that's one of the biggest takeaways from Ferguson's book. The forces that shaped the 20th century, they're still very much at play in the 21st century.
So it's not just about understanding the past.
It's about recognizing how the past continues to shape the present.
And how it might shape the future.
Right.
Which is why it's so important for us to learn from history.
If we want to prevent these same kinds of conflicts from happening again.
Exactly. And I think that's a perfect segue into our next segment, where we'll explore how Ferguson's analysis of the 20th century can shed some light on the challenges we're facing today.
Sounds good.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to digging into that.
Me too.
All right, so let's take a quick break, and we'll be right back with more on War of the World.
Sounds good. One of the things that really struck me about Ferguson's book, is how he connects the rise of racial thinking back in the 18th and 19th centuries to all the horrors that we saw in the 20th century. It's like he's saying that these seemingly abstract ideas about race actually had these really concrete and devastating consequences in the real world. Like, they paved the way for discrimination, segregation, and ultimately genocide.
Yeah, it's easy to look back at those old racial theories and kind of dismiss them as, just outdated science.
Mm.
But Ferguson really shows how they were used to justify some of the most brutal acts of the 20th century. And what's even more unsettling, I think,
Hmm.
is how those ideas continue to echo in our own time, even if they're not as explicitly stated.
Right. Like, think about the rise of ethnic nationalism and xenophobia that we're
Mhm.
seeing in different parts of the world today. A lot of these movements, they tap into those same underlying anxieties about racial purity and cultural identity that Ferguson traces back to the 19th century.
So it's not just about understanding the past, it's about recognizing how the past is still shaping the present. Which
Exactly.
brings us to another really key theme in Ferguson's book, the role of economics in fueling conflict.
He makes a really compelling argument that economic instability is often a key ingredient in the recipe for violence.
Like a catalyst almost.
Right. He uses the Great Depression as a prime example,
Yeah.
showing how that economic collapse in the 1930s created this breeding ground for extremist movements like Nazism.
It makes sense though, right? When people are desperate and unemployed and looking for someone to blame.
They're looking for answers. They want someone to tell them why they're suffering and what they can do about it.
And it wasn't just Germany. We see similar patterns in other parts of the world, like Japan, for instance, where the economic downturn in the 1930s contributed to the rise of militarism and expansionism.
And Ferguson argues that this link between economics and conflict isn't just a historical phenomenon.
Hmm.
He thinks we should be paying attention to economic trends today, especially things like the growing gap between the rich and the poor, because these could be early warning signs of future instability and violence.
That's a sobering thought.
It is.
So we've got racial tensions, we've got economic volatility,
Yeah.
and then we add in the decline of empires, which Ferguson sees as another major driver of conflict in the 20th century.
Right. He describes it as this kind of domino effect,
So,
where the collapse of one empire can destabilize entire regions.
yet, think about the collapse of the Ottoman Empire after World War I. That led to the creation of all these new states in the Middle East.
And a lot of those new states ended up with these really arbitrary borders that didn't reflect the existing ethnic and religious divisions on the ground.
Which, of course, continue to fuel conflict in the region to this day. It's like those imperial powers were holding a lid on a boiling pot. And once that lid was removed, everything just exploded.
Great analogy.
Thanks.
And Ferguson argues that we're still dealing with the aftershocks of those imperial collapses today. I mean, look at the conflicts in Iraq, Syria, and Afghanistan. Those are all, at least in part, legacies of those earlier imperial struggles.
It's mind-boggling to think about how events that happened a century ago can still have such a profound impact on our world today.
It's a reminder that history is never really over,
It's always with us.
shaping the present and the future.
And that brings us to another really important point that Ferguson makes. The 20th century wasn't just about a few big wars. It was about this constant underlying current of conflict that touched every corner of the globe.
Right. It wasn't just about the big battles and the famous leaders.
Yeah.
He also looks at all the smaller scale conflicts, the civil wars, the ethnic cleansings, the revolutions, all those things that often get overshadowed by the bigger events.
And he argues that those smaller conflicts were often just as brutal and destructive as the big wars.
Especially for the people who were caught in the crossfire.
He tells the story of the Russian Civil War, for example, which followed right on the heels of World War I and was arguably even more devastating for the Russian people.
Well, they had just gone through one horrific conflict, and then they were immediately plunged into another.
And it wasn't just a war between two armies. It was this chaotic mix of ethnic conflict, political upheaval, economic collapse, all playing out against the backdrop of the Bolshevik Revolution.
It's a reminder that revolutions, even those that are fought in the name of noble ideals, can have a very dark side.
Absolutely.
And Ferguson doesn't shy away from describing the brutality of that conflict, the mass executions, the famine, the sheer scale of human suffering.
It's a sobering reminder that violence often begets more violence.
And that even when one conflict ends, the seeds of the next one are often already being sown.
It's like those Russian nesting dolls. You open one up, and there's another one inside, and another, and another.
It's a great image.
It just feels like this endless cycle of conflict.
And I think that speaks to one of Ferguson's main points. We can't understand the 20th century just by focusing on the big events,
We have to look at the broader context
the underlying patterns of conflict.
that have shaped the world we live in.
Exactly.
So how do we break out of this cycle? Does Ferguson offer any solutions?
He doesn't claim to have all the answers, but he does offer some insights into how we might be able to prevent future conflict.
Okay, I'm all ears.
One of his key recommendations is the importance of understanding history and learning from the mistakes of the past.
It's like that famous quote, "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it."
Exactly.
But it's more than just remembering the past. It's about understanding it.
Right. It's about recognizing the patterns of conflict and figuring out how to avoid repeating those patterns.
And I think that's where Ferguson's book is so valuable.
It's not just a history lesson.
Right, it's a call to action.
It challenges us to think critically about the world around us, to recognize the warning signs of conflict, and to work towards creating a more just and peaceful future.
I'm curious to hear more about his specific recommendations. Like, what steps can we actually take as individuals and as a global community to address these underlying causes of conflict?
Well, one of his key points is the importance of promoting tolerance and understanding between different cultures and ethnic groups.
So breaking down those us versus them barriers.
Exactly. He argues that we need to move beyond these simplistic narratives of good versus evil and recognize the shared humanity that connects us all.
It sounds a bit idealistic, but I think he's right.
I do too.
If we can learn to see each other as human beings first and foremost,
Yeah.
it might make it harder to justify violence and discrimination.
Absolutely. And he also emphasizes the importance of addressing economic inequality.
Because poverty and deprivation can create fertile ground for extremism and violence.
Exactly.
So it's not just about promoting peace and understanding. It's also about creating a more just and equitable world.
Right. It's about addressing the root causes of conflict.
And what about building strong institutions and democratic processes? Those seem pretty crucial for resolving conflicts peacefully.
He talks about that too, about the importance of having systems in place that allow for peaceful transitions of power and for people to have a voice in their government.
So it sounds like he's advocating for this kind of holistic approach, tackling these issues on multiple fronts.
Exactly.
It's not just about military intervention or diplomacy. It's about addressing the root causes of conflict.
And he also emphasizes the role of education.
Education.
Yeah, he believes that teaching people about history, about different cultures, about the dangers of prejudice and intolerance, that's crucial to preventing future conflicts.
So it's about empowering people with knowledge
And critical thinking skills.
to challenge those harmful ideologies that can lead to violence.
Exactly.
That's a really powerful message.
It is.
It's about recognizing that we all have a role to play in creating a more peaceful world.
It's not just up to governments or international organizations.
It starts with each of us.
With our own attitudes and actions.
Well said. But changing hearts and minds is a long and difficult process. Do you think Ferguson is optimistic about our chances of breaking free from this cycle of conflict?
He's definitely realistic about the challenges. He acknowledges that human nature is flawed, that we're capable of great acts of violence and cruelty.
Right.
But he also believes that we're capable of learning and growing and evolving.
So there's hope.
Yes. He sees hope in the fact that we have made progress in some areas, like reducing global poverty and promoting democracy.
So it's not a naive optimism, but it's a hopeful realism.
Exactly.
Grounded in the belief that we can do better.
And I think that's a message that we all need to hear right now, especially given the state of the world. It's easy to get overwhelmed by all the bad news, all the conflict and division.
It can be really disheartening.
It can.
But Ferguson reminds us that we're not powerless.
We can make a difference, even if it's just in our own small corner of the world.
Well, that's an empowering message, but it's also a little daunting. Like, where do we even begin?
I think the first step is to educate ourselves. Ferguson's book is a great place to start, but there are so many other resources out there.
Like what?
Books, documentaries, podcasts, articles. Talk to people from different cultures. The more we know, the better equipped we'll be to challenge prejudice and intolerance.
Okay, so educate ourselves. What else?
Get involved. Support organizations that are working to promote peace and understanding.
So like donate to charities or volunteer our time.
Exactly, and speak out against injustice whenever you see it.
Even if it's uncomfortable.
Right. We have to be willing to have those difficult conversations, to challenge our own assumptions, and to listen to perspectives that are different from our own.
It's not about being right all the time.
It's about being open to learning and growing.
And seeing the world through different lenses.
Exactly.
I love that. I think that's a great takeaway. Yeah. But before we move on to our final segment, I want to touch on one more aspect of Ferguson's book that I found particularly compelling. His analysis of World War I and the experiences of soldiers in the trenches.
Yeah, that was a really powerful section.
It was.
He paints such a vivid and harrowing picture of life in the trenches. He uses firsthand accounts and literature to really convey the sheer horror of that conflict.
One of the passages that really stuck with me is where he describes the Battle of the Somme, which was one of the bloodiest battles in human history.
Oh, wow.
He writes, the British bombardment had failed to destroy the German defenses, and the attacking waves were mown down by machine gun fire. The ground was churned up into a muddy quagmire, littered with the dead and dying. It was a scene of unimaginable carnage.
It's hard to even imagine the scale of loss in that battle.
Over 1 million men were killed or wounded.
It's just staggering.
And Ferguson argues that the trauma of World War I, especially the experience of trench warfare, had this really profound impact on the rest of the 20th century.
In what way?
Well, he suggests that the war shattered those old illusions of glory and heroism that were associated with warfare, and it left an entire generation scarred and disillusioned.
Which made them more susceptible to extremist ideologies.
Like fascism.
Right. Which promised a return to order and strength.
Exactly.
It's a chilling reminder of how war can not only destroy lives, but also warp our understanding of the world.
And I think it's something we need to be mindful of today, as we grapple with the legacies of past conflicts and the threat of new ones.
I agree.
Well, I think this is a good place to pause for now. We've covered a lot of ground, from the rise of racial thinking to the horrors of trench warfare, but there's still much more to explore in Ferguson's book,
Right.
including his analysis of the Cold War and the rise of radical Islam.
I'm really looking forward to diving into those topics.
Me too. And seeing how his insights can help us better understand the challenges we face in the 21st century.
I think it'll be really illuminating.
So we talked about how these echoes of empires and economic turmoil and racial thinking, they all kind of reverberate through the 20th century. But what about the Cold War? Where does that fit into Ferguson's fatal formula?
Well, you know what's so interesting is that Ferguson sees the Cold War not so much as this clash of ideologies, but more as a continuation of all those same forces that we've been discussing.
So like a new chapter in that same old story.
Yeah, exactly. He argues that the U.S. and the Soviet Union, they were essentially vying for power in this void that was left by all those crumbling European empires.
It's like the game board changed, but the players were still the same.
Yeah, and they were still playing by those same old rules. Competition for resources, territory, influence.
But this time it came with the added bonus of nuclear weapons.
Right.
I mean, the threat of mutually assured destruction, that must have added a whole new level of anxiety to the conflict.
Oh, absolutely. Ferguson talks about how close the world came to nuclear war on several occasions, like the Cuban Missile Crisis, for example.
It's a chilling thought, especially when you consider the tensions we're seeing today between nuclear-armed states.
Yeah, it's a reminder that those risks haven't gone away.
So the Cold War was this continuation of these long-standing patterns of conflict. But what about the world after the fall of the Berlin Wall? How does Ferguson see things unfolding in that post-Cold War era?
Well, you might think that with the collapse of the Soviet Union, the world would have finally entered this new era of peace and stability. But Ferguson points out that the end of the Cold War didn't erase those underlying tensions.
So those problems were still simmering beneath the surface.
Exactly. And in some cases, the end of the Cold War actually exacerbated those tensions.
He talks about the rise of ethnic conflict in the 1990s, like what happened in Yugoslavia and Rwanda.
Right. Those are just two really tragic examples of how the removal of that Cold War rivalry actually allowed some of these long-suppressed ethnic tensions to erupt.
It's like the world took a deep breath and then just exhaled all this pent-up conflict.
And Ferguson is very clear that these conflicts weren't just the result of these ancient hatreds suddenly bubbling to the surface.
There was more to it than that.
Yeah, they were often fueled by political opportunism, economic inequality, and the failure to create inclusive political institutions.
Again, we see that fatal formula at work, even after the supposed end of history.
Exactly. It's like those ingredients for conflict are always there, just waiting for the right spark to ignite them.
And one of those sparks, according to Ferguson,
was
the rise of radical Islam.
Right.
He argues that this movement, with its roots in anti-Western sentiment, and a sense of grievance over the decline of traditional Islamic empires, that this movement emerged as a major force in the late 20th century.
And it continues to shape global events today.
And that brings us to a really crucial point. Ferguson doesn't just analyze the past. He challenges us to apply those historical lessons to the present. He's constantly asking, what does this all mean for us today? So let's put on our future thinking caps for a minute. What are some of the key takeaways from Ferguson's analysis that we can apply to the 21st century?
Well, I think one of the biggest takeaways is that we need to understand and address those underlying forces that drive conflict. The ethnic tensions, the economic inequality, the legacies of imperial decline. These issues haven't just magically disappeared because we've entered a new century.
Right, they're still with us in new and more complex forms.
Exactly.
So we can't just ignore them and hope they'll go away.
Right.
We have to actively work to address them. But that seems like such a massive undertaking.
It is.
So where do we even begin? What can we as individuals actually do?
It might sound overwhelming, but even small actions can make a difference.
Like what?
Well, Ferguson talks about the importance of promoting tolerance and understanding between different cultures and ethnic groups.
So starting with ourselves?
Right. Challenging our own prejudices, being open to different perspectives, engaging in constructive dialogue, even with people we disagree with.
It's about remembering that we're all human beings.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That we're all in this together.
Even when it feels like the world is falling apart.
Exactly.
And I think that's a really powerful message of hope that Ferguson leaves us with.
I agree.
He acknowledges the darkness and the brutality of the 20th century, but he also sees those glimmers of hope in the progress that we've made. He believes that we have the capacity to learn from the mistakes of the past and to create a better future.
A future where conflict is less likely.
And where peace and understanding prevail.
I like that.
Well, folks, there you have it. Our deep dive into Niall Ferguson's War of the World, a book that challenges us to confront the complexities of the 20th century and to apply its lessons to the challenges we face today.
It's a book that really makes you think.
It does. And hopefully this conversation has sparked your curiosity and inspired you to explore this book further.
As Ferguson says, the best way to understand the present is to study the past.
So pick up a copy of War of the World and embark on your own journey of discovery. And until next time, keep those pages turning and those minds churning. Thanks for joining us on Books and Bytes.
Thanks, everyone.